So I think a lot of you know that Synergos promotes bridging leadership, and that's a big piece of who we are and what we do. And this subject is certainly a subject about bridging. And I was trying to think how to characterize it, but maybe the best way is to say that it bridges between science and spirituality and maybe even mysticism. And our speakers can correct me if I got that completely wrong, but that's what came to me this morning as I was thinking about this. And it's been a very collaborative effort to put this forward. You will soon be meeting Jason Yotopoulos and Jeff Walker, who are our beginning presenters. And then you will also get to meet Dr. Lorenzo Cohen, who's going to make a presentation as well. So I don't want to take up more time than needed in introductions, but my friend and Synergos board member and global activist, Elliot Donnelly, even though he's been sheltering in San Francisco for the last 3 months, Elliot is going to be our facilitator, and I'm going to turn it over to him and look forward to experiencing all of this with you.
Peggy, thank you so much. I'm incredibly excited about this gathering. It feels like I see so many familiar faces and members of my Synergos family. So hello, family. I'm very happy to be hosting this incredible, what I hope will be really an informative and an amazing presentation. Both of these gentlemen are incredibly accomplished people. I think, I'll start with Jason. I think he is now the head of the Emerald Gate Foundation. And he is the CEO there and a board member. He's also been an entrepreneur. He's worked in the top echelons of the corporate world, sort of in the top group at SAP. As a member of the global research team, he was at Sun Microsystems. He was at InfoSeek. He was a venture capitalist. He was Stanford MBA, Stanford undergrad. Very deeply thoughtful human being. But he's also had a deep commitment to exploring phenomena which I think science can't currently fully describe. And so I think he and I met and had a very deep conversation about that. And Jeff, also is somebody who has an incredible background. He was the former vice chairman of JP Morgan Chase. He was the CEO and co-founder of JP Morgan Partners. He serves on numerous boards, the Grammys Music Education. He was on the Berklee College of Music. He's been at MIT's Media Lab, Harvard School of Public Health, UVA's undergraduate business school. I mean, the list goes on. An incredibly accomplished person who has deep experience in pushing system change forward. And I think that the final person who we'll be talking with is Lorenzo Cohen, who I just met on Zoom. I hope to have in-person meetings with him in the future, but he's the University of Texas, MD Anderson Cancer Center, Richard Haynes Distinguished Professor in Clinical Cancer Prevention. He's the Director of Integrative Medicine Program there, and he's going to be presenting his work in exploring biofields therapy in oncology. So listen, without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Jeff, and just incredibly happy to be here and humbled to be a moderator in this event.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you, Elliot. And thank you, Peggy. And thank you, everyone, for being a partner with Synergos. And I'm happy to have joined Synergos to be a member as well. And I love working with others. And so being with you is a joy. I first met Jason on a retreat. And so it was a spiritual retreat. We got to know each other and connected and found that we had joint passions, just like Elliot and I did, and joint passion with music. And having people play together is something I really like to support. And that's what we're doing here. We're playing together. We're finding things that we also have passion around, and we can join together and help support and share knowledge with each other. In 1973 at University of Virginia, I wrote a paper when I first got there on Kirlian photography, the study of energy around leaves and hands and body. And so I've been interested kind of ever since in what is around the body and the human body, and what is that energy, how does it feel, and what is it. I started meditating in 74 there as well and started my spiritual journey. So that was a long time ago. And that's why I'm aiming my philanthropy as well as investments in the mindful wellness world and I've been supporting the mindfulness movement for 30 years, I guess. And we set up something called Bridge Builders we'll talk about, but it's an investment group with Bo Shao, a Synergos member, and others doing mindful wellness deals. And then finding strategies around wellness. I worked with a guy named Ray Chambers that's also a Synergos member, and I work on community health with the UN and WHO and focusing on wellness. And so I love the idea of integrating in traditional things like mindfulness and acupuncture and energy and work also on psychedelics and some others into the more mainstream of the medical health system. I think that's a fun experience. It's interesting to me in figuring out these ensembles we can work with is something that I love to grow, love to find other people who are also passionate about it as well. So thank you for that. And I'll hand it over to Jason to tell a few things.
Wonderful, Jeff. Thank you. And boy, I can't imagine a better way to spend a morning than talking about one of our favorite topics and perhaps how to facilitate some change. Jeff, it's been a pleasure to partner with you, and then Elliot and Peggy. Ever since our first meeting, it was clear that we'd have a lot of fun together. Sometimes people ask me, how did you're a pretty conventional guy on paper, as kind of Elliot characterized. How did you get into some of these areas? And it turns out that ever since a kid, I was noticing, different things. For example, just in terms of, my lineage, my great-grandmother on my mother's side used to pick up the phone, know exactly who was calling, which really freaked a lot of people in the community out. So she'd pick up the phone, "Hi, John." And this was, these were days before caller ID, needless to say. My grandmother on my father's side used to have a cure for something called evil eye. And in some Middle Eastern and Greek tradition, it's when someone looks at someone with envy, and particularly light-haired, light-skinned people, it tends to affect their mood. And she used to have this little tincture with water and oil, and she used to, say a prayer over it, and the oil used to dissipate into 1,000 little beads. And, which is something I always used to look at, and I used to sit and look over her shoulder. It didn't make any sense to me. And then when I was in high school, I went down the street to Stanford Research Institute. Turns out 2 gentlemen, Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, were doing research on something called remote viewing, where one, sort of moves their consciousness to remote locations. It was being used for purposes of espionage and funded to the tune of $30 million by the US government in the 70s. And it turns out later in my career, I found that there were some Silicon Valley companies indeed using remote viewing to look beyond the event horizon. And so, very anomalous things. By the time I hit Stanford as an undergraduate engineer, my wife, who at the time, was a junior, invited me to her dorm. And she says, there's something going on in our dorm. It seems right up your alley. We've got a set of psychics. And you want to come down and, sit in. And so I sat across from a woman I had never met, and she read me like a book. And again, having been interested in these realms of parapsychology and spirituality ever since I was a young child, I knew intellectually that this is possible, but now experientially, I knew it. And I said to her, "How do you do this?" And she said, "Would you like to learn?" And that led to, venture capitalist by day, 3 evenings a week, learning how to actually read information in auras. And I think that's probably a much longer story over perhaps a drink sometime. But ever since that time, I was fascinated with these various anomalies, things that experientially perhaps we know, but our Western scientific worldview tells us is not substantial. Intervening 30 years of the work world, as Elliot characterized, and I took a look around 5 years ago, and expecting to see some progress, it turns out very little had changed in terms of a shift in worldview. There was ever more robust evidence that these types of things, like energy healing and subtle energy that we're talking about today, are out there and valid, but very little shift in the worldview. That was frustrating to me as someone that knows experientially that we are more. And so these days, as was mentioned, I'm full-time trying to figure out, one, how to understand and learn, and then two, how to perhaps help facilitate change in some of these areas. So let's talk about what we're going to cover today. So specifically, there are a few things that we'd like to convey. First of all, in the topic of subtle energy and biofield healing, we believe that energy healing can be life-changing, that it's scientifically supported, and that it can be a complementary part of our current healthcare system. Secondly, we believe now is the right time to integrate some of this. There are many inadequacies in the current healthcare system, in particular when it comes to chronic conditions in terms of efficacy and cost. And it's particularly relevant conversation given current health equity issues. And we believe there's an opportunity to reset some of the current health paradigm. Not only delivery, but also preventative self-care, enabling people to take responsibility increasingly for their health. There's also, we found out over the past year, and we'll talk about the study, there's a huge existing market today and a validated precedent for how to mainstream actually such alternative approaches through systems change and that approach to impact, as was done in mindfulness. And then finally, we can build a collaborative partnership of funders who can make this happen with many philanthropic and perhaps even investment opportunities. So with that, let's jump into the slides. Great, and we can move to the next slide. So generally speaking, we're well aware that modern medicine, allopathic medicine, has brought us tremendous benefits. Generally, what it can be thought of as physical medicine, dealing with drugs, surgery, or other physical manipulations. It turns out, however, as I'd mentioned, this model is not entirely effective getting to root causes or chronic conditions. Turns out it's extremely costly, especially in the Western world as well. As a result, and out of necessity, we're moving more toward an integrative health. And if we take a look at the mind-body medicine movement, which began around 20 to 30 years ago, it was started to address many of these more psychological needs, right? And it turns out 20, 30 years ago, a lot of people really doubted whether or not this psychosomatic effect was valid. We believe that since that time, it's made tremendous progress, meaning a number of unmet needs. And we believe that energy medicine is on a similar path. Now, what's the difference between the three? As I mentioned, modern medicine can be thought of as physical manipulation of one's physical body for health. Mind-body medicine is one's consciousness or mind positively influencing the physical body. And thirdly, energy medicine is still a consciousness affecting one's physical body for the purpose of health, but it may be another's consciousness. In other words, transpersonally or non-locally affecting health. And we believe that we've got a path to help energy medicine progress in the way that we've seen mind-body medicine move over the past couple of years. So with that, we can go to the next slide. Now, very relevant question. Great, what is energy medicine? What is subtle energy? And we can view subtle energy and the energetic field as a putative, invisible, self-organizing field of influence. So almost an energetic field of information that guides the body system or natural systems to homeostasis. So one can think about it as a blueprint for the physical body. Now, the National Institutes of Health in the US, named it the biofield in the early 90s, yet millennia-old traditions have been referring to such an energetic field of information and intelligence in their healing traditions, whether it's prana, chi, ki, or other names. And we believe actually that they all share a good bit of commonality, a common approach. Now, it would be fascinating to have an image of the biofield. We don't have that yet. We can't measure it itself with our instruments. The way in which we can measure it is through a transducer like the human body and its influence on the human body. Now, we're prioritizing the imaging of the biofield because we believe it could be context shifting, help really shift the worldview, almost like the first time Edgar Mitchell, one of our early astronauts, viewed the Earth from space. Yet at the same time, here on the left, we do have renderings of the biofield, like this one from Alex Gray. And as you can see, there are energy centers down the middle, thought of as chakras, right? Energy channels, thought of as meridians, right? There's an energetic field around the body, this aura that I had referred to earlier that I was looking at in my 20s against all odds. And so that's this sort of energetic bubble in layers around the body. And then the lines drawn out from the body, perhaps represent a connection to the broader energetic field, a unified field of energy and information, perhaps even non-locally. Now, in spite of these traditions, these millennial traditions, there has not been extensive scientific study of these topics until recently. And so what we did is we said, look, what has been done by way of validating this putative energetic field and the efficacy of some of these, these energy healing modalities. And so what we did is we did a study determining that there were over 6,000 publications, scientific studies on energy medicine. This is in the English language alone. And so in this chart, we're showing, roughly the 200 to 300 of the most rigorous peer-reviewed, double-blind clinical studies across modalities. Most were exploratory as opposed to confirmatory. But as you can see on the bottom, they include things like distant healing, the modalities of healing touch and therapeutic touch, Reiki, with which many of us are familiar with, energy psychology, which involves, a form of tapping. And so, the good news is that these studies are establishing the foundation of scientific validity, yet at the same time, there's much to be done. But the research is also happening at increasingly highly credible institutions. And so you'll hear Dr. Lorenzo Cohen talk about the work, just under $1 million a year, that we'll be doing starting in the fall at MD Anderson Cancer Center, with energy healers and mice. Brown is just concluding a study, the results of which are to be released this summer, on cancer pain and Qigong. Harvard is looking at the brain. UC San Diego, Dr. Paul Mills there was involved in a prior study I spoke a few years ago about at Synergos. And so, so the great news is that tier 1 research organizations are currently conducting biofield research. And importantly, many of these top researchers in their field, behind a closed door, will tell you that this is the most important topic they could be working on right now. None of their training has told them that it's at all valid, but many of these people have had experiences that they can't deny. And they're interested in bridging, as Peggy said, the science and the spirituality. And let me tell you a little bit about an exploratory study we did at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. I mentioned astronaut Edgar Mitchell. He was one of the founders of this organization that is focused largely on consciousness. We did a 6-month study focused on chronic pain. Chronic pain happens to be a very interesting beachhead for us to make good headway with this topic, given that it's underserved by allopathic medicine. In this case, we were looking at carpal tunnel. 200 subjects, 17 exceptional healers from across different modalities. And the objective was to figure out, one, is this, are there validated outcomes for this type of energy healing when it comes to pain? 2, what may be the mechanism of action in the human body? And 3, to the extent something's moving between the healer and healee, what is that at the physics level? And so this is just a first cut, but just to give you an example, highly statistically and clinically significant decrease in pain, an increase in the healees in self-transcendence, which means the ego was increasingly backed off over time relative to their shift in worldview. Heart rate variability, which is the second derivative of heart rate, or the change in the rate of the heartbeat, indicated increased parasympathetic activity during the healings. Quantum or random number generators, which are normally random, went coherent in the midst of the healer during the healing. which Dr. Dean Radin refers to as a perturbation of space-time. So if you think Star Wars, there's a perturbation in the field, right? And they're still trying to figure out what that means, but that means that there's a quantum effect going on in the room. And then interestingly, we had little aliquots of water on the healer, Helian, in the environment. And it turns out that those aliquots of water shifted in spectroscopic absorption range, in particular in infrared, which means that there's a shift in the bond angle in the H2O, which means that there's a shift in the way in which the water clusters, dimers, trimers, hexagonal crystalline structures, which may be a form, this is totally a postulate now, that we're looking to validate or invalidate. It may be that there's a form of information storage in the water itself, which water itself is quite fascinating. So each of these studies yields many more studies, and we just parse down the tree, validate or invalidate. Now it turns out that unlike mind-body medicine 20 or 30 years ago, there's a widespread practice of energy healing. This is only in the US, over 70,000 biofield healing practitioners, largely focused on beachhead areas like chronic pain, cancer recovery, anxiety, trauma, depression, over $3 billion, very conservatively estimated in market size. And again, all of this is with no reimbursement whatsoever. Turns out, if you just take a look at one of these, Reiki is currently offered at over 60 conventional, some of the largest hospitals in the US. I was recently speaking to the vice chancellor of UC Irvine. They're in the process of training 2,000 of their nurses on Reiki. Why is that? Is that the easiest thing they could bring in the hospital? No, because it's effective. It's cost effective and it has efficacy. And so you can see many of these are formally trained. There are big opportunities yet at the same time in terms of orchestrating this community. So to sum up, my portion of the presentation, indeed, there are analogies to the mindfulness movement that started 20, 30 years ago, which have been quite successful. It faced long-standing skepticism from the scientific and medical communities. And the question is, obviously you see here mindfulness and energy and biofield healing go back millennia, but in the US, just starting to dovetail in an integrated fashion with modern medicine. The question is, how did mindfulness do this? How did the mind-body medicine actually make this shift to mainstreaming in a way that it's paired with conventional institutions today? And it turns out, if you take a close look at it, this was done through a systems change approach, and a systematic roadmap to address the entire ecosystem. And it turns out that there were rigorous scientists working with prominent practitioners right from the East to understand and validate these modalities. And it also turns out that there was a central orchestrator, an organization called the Mind Life Institute, that was orchestrating across each constituent and each ecosystem area to remove the largest roadblocks first. And, as Jeff and I started to talk about this methodology, it was clear to me that whereas Emerald Gate is very focused on the science, and that is necessary, it is necessary but insufficient if the objective is to drive a broader change. And so the great news is, Jeff himself has a lot of personal experience in bringing systems change work to malaria, homelessness, and even mindfulness. And so with that, let's hand off to Jeff, and he can talk about what we learned in this year-long systems mapping effort, and then what is the action plan going forward?
Yeah, as Jason said, the path many of us probably were on from the 70s on related to mindfulness and mind-body medicine was, gee, we're weird. What's going on with that? Here's me as the vice chairman at JP Morgan teaching meditation at 9/11. But they let me do it because, good things happened. Mind Life was really important. The Summer Institute, getting the academics together to share knowledge, to find there's other people that are weird too, and it wasn't so weird. And so they put together some studies at research, level 1 universities that confirmed, and using fMRIs and technology, that there was something like the default mode network that went quiet during long periods of meditation. So the science grew, as well as awareness. Mark Bertolini, CEO of Aetna, brought it to his entire company. Google brought it to his entire company. And so now it's embedded. Now our investment group, we helped fund the startup 8 years ago of Headspace and Happify and Insight Timer and Pear Technologies through the FDA. FDA now has digital therapy approvals. And for ADHD and a number of other things. This is a technique that seems to work, but again, there was no revenue when we all started this in the mindfulness movement. There appears to be up to $3 billion of revenue in this healing space today, which is kind of amazing. So it'll draw more talent and more attention if we do more scientific verification of it. And so what we did on the next slide is Jason and I and Tom Dingledine funded a report, and a group called SHE, Consciousness and Healing Initiative, led the analysis, saying who's out there that is working on this? What kind of studies are out there that we can leverage off of? How many are credible? Where could we put a little more time and talent? And so over almost a year period, we had this report done. I think all of you have probably received a link to it. If not, we can send that to you. And we found out there's 400 researchers in this space. There's 225 research organizations. There's 125 large-scale healing organizations that teach people how to do the work. There's 6,200 publications around this one. And there's 280 types of devices. You have to measure photonic energy, light energy. You have to figure out electromagnetic energy and start measuring that. And how do we do that? And how do we do it in Faraday cages so it's not just, distracted by external devices? How do you look at sound? How do you look at light? Because that's all part of this work. That's system change. You start to figure out who's out there first. You don't try to come in with the answers. The problem many times is people want to lean, oh, I know the answer. I have the perfect strategy to heal all people. No, it's probably not. And so let's start figuring out who's been working on what, where, and how, and identify those levers of change. And so not meant for you to read this necessarily, but it shows you a little bit of kind of mapping that we have done. And the first thing you do when you work on systems change, and I've worked on system change in a lot of areas, from malaria to community health to slavery models to poverty and New Profit and others. And there are similar strategies, not all the same, but you kind of look at, okay, what are the communities that are already out there? What kind of investigations have been done? What kind of awareness is out there about how to communicate what we've been doing to others? What kind of communities have been developed? Gee, can we work on reimbursement and policy change strategies? Who's doing that now? And so you start discovering potential partners, people that you can work with who have the same interest in solving the same problems or to reduce the suffering that's out there, particularly in the health world. And so you start looking at the different areas of levers of change. And these are pretty typical. You'll spend more time depending on the problem on certain of the areas, but what kind of technology is out there? How do you find the practitioners that you can empower? You can start creating, certifications for who is good quality. How do you set up and support communities so that people start coming together? What kind of education system do you have to allow people to be trained, to allow people to know what these different tools are, to create therapists that actually understand the different tools that are available to them? I find in my mindfulness world, I've changed my practice over the years. And what works on certain issues around healing probably will change depending on what that issue is. What kind of funding can we allocate to this? In the beginning of system change, what I've found is that there are great opportunities for venture philanthropy, for philanthropists to come in together and put a little bit of money to create those high lever changes. And we've done this in malaria. We did this with Malaria No More and created awareness. We did many other areas as well. And so how do we start identifying what those levers are, those opportunities for change could be? And so you look at, what can we work on in these core areas, and kind of look at a few things like this imaging. This imaging is so important. Imagine the image of at Apollo 8 where you saw the image of the moon. with the earth in the background. And that changed many people's perception of what the earth was about. The Whole Earth Catalog came from that, and many others. And so think about an image of this energy field, and so everybody goes, oh, there really is one. Well, how do we measure it? And many other things will come out of it. So we think that's an important thing to work on. What kind of funding can we work on? You'll hear from Lorenzo in a second, but is there funding for research that we can push forward, like we did with Richie Davidson, like we did with Amishi Jha and mindfulness? Then she got tenured under mindfulness, or Judd Brewer at Brown. There's a lot of work going on at Brown that on Reiki and cancer, and is that a good one? Is UCSD work? And so together, we as a collaborative can talk about which ones we think are relevant that we want to support. What kind of devices? There's a lot of devices. Is which ones are best? Or gee, do we need a new one? Or do we need to support, something that can be tweaked to measure outcomes? And without measurement of outcomes, it's kind of hard to prove scientifically whether these really are happening or not, or whether they're just placebo effect, where it's nice to have somebody who cares about someone and they tend to get better. We have to prove that there's actually something happening here. A communications plan, a reimbursement. I have a team at Bridge Builders where we work on reimbursement for mindfulness and that work. How do we do that same point here? And so we have, started over the last 2 months or so during the COVID crisis. We've taken and had some really great conversations, and we're still having them, to create this partnership. And what that means is a group of people who have similar passions, who bring different things to the table to add value, and want to share that. And I've done that in Bridge Builders. We have 8, soon to be 10 partners who've been working together for the last 8 years. And we have really a lot of fun getting together and talking about the opportunities and sharing. I'll do a little of this one. Oh, that's interesting. Let's do that together. And so 2 or 3 of us may fund one thing. All 8 of us may fund something. But it's just a conversation about, here's what I'm hearing. Gee, one person's got a background in finance, another person has background in health. And that's kind of what we're doing here with Jason and I, and Tom Dingeldine is at Board of Wake Forest, is a successful entrepreneur, but also he's been trained for 3 years in healing under the Brennan system. And so he is a healer as well. David Dominic is Jason's partner at Emerald Gate, and David Leipson is on our call today, and he's our collaborative glue. He's the person that holds us together. We have a similar thing in Bridge Builders as well, where we have someone that says, I'm going to make sure that each of our investments is tracked. Each one, accesses the talent of the network as much as possible. We have Ivy Ross, who's a senior member of the Google management team, and she runs all product design for them. And when I got on the phone first with Ivy, she said, this is my passion. This is what I want to do after Google. I got on the phone with Rudy Tanzi, who's an advisor of ours, and he's at Harvard Mass General. And talking to Rudy, he says, this is what I want to do after I cure Alzheimer's. I go, well, first cure Alzheimer's, but this is really good that you want to partner with us as well. So it's finding these partners that can connect with us and come together. And all that happens, this is not a fund. All we do is to share our costs, which are not that significant, and share our knowledge. And it's something that people just want to passionately connect with each other. And so then we look at outcomes. Without measurable outcomes, how do you partner? How do you know you're actually accomplishing something and working together for that overall change? And so we can look at scientific outcomes, saying, which studies have we been supporting, and what are their results? What issues around technology can we work on? How do we build community? We're already looking at 3 different groups that are coming together, starting to say, how do we post what healing strategies are, who the healers are, and how to connect them to potential users? I'd say one of the weaknesses we have right now, which we love to cure, is less knowledge about what's going on in the rest of the world. We focus a lot in the United States. We have a little bit of information and more information on what's going on in China, particularly with Qi and energy transmission there as well. There's some things going on in Europe, but I'd say we have a lot more to learn. And so that's what we'd love to spend more time with others and trying to leverage as well. Why do we care about this? We think this is a valid paradigm. Jason's experienced it. I was sitting behind Jason at the retreat, and you could tell there was something going on with Jason. He was connecting in a different, deeper way. And I started talking to him, and Jason is a healer. So we know it's there. I know auras are here. Each of us kind of knows it ourselves, but then how do we start bringing that feeling, that idea out to most others? How do we understand the role of this in the general healing process, build support of it, and bring it to everybody? Let's make it available so it's not just exclusive, but it's really a thing of reducing suffering and enhancing joy to each others. So again, we believe that healing through biofields and subtle energy works and can help the current healthcare system. We think it's the right time right now to do this using models like from mindfulness and others. We think it's a huge market, and we can use precedents from before, and pulling together a group of funders I've seen be very effective in many other areas of problem change, and that's what we're trying to do here as well. So Jason, hand it over to you to introduce Lorenzo.
You can hear it from us. I think it's more relevant for you to hear it from perhaps a medical researcher and doctor. Dr. Lorenzo Cohen has actually become a friend over the past many months that we've been working together. Turns out that the research that he has done, that he was led to out of his own personal healing journey with alternative medicine, is quite parallel to some of the work that my partner David and Dominic and I have been doing on energy healing. Lorenzo is a wonderful human being. He has a really high bar for rigor when it comes to the science, and he's motivated to help reduce suffering. And so with that, Lorenzo, maybe talk a little bit about some of the prior work you've done, and then where we're headed over the course of the next couple of years together relative to energy healing and work on cancer.
I can't tell you in listening to what I've heard so far from this group, which, on paper, as was said at the beginning, the people who are speaking, and probably many on the call with this deep interest and passion, on the surface, you wouldn't say, these are people who are going to lead the world in the field of alternative medicine. And so hearing the passion, the interest, and already the tremendous investment in this area that I think is truly our future of understanding humans is phenomenal. Just very, very quickly about myself. I'm trained actually as a research psychologist, and with the primary interest in my training of stress and stress biology. And of course, that led me into this area of mindfulness. But since essentially I was born, I was exposed to what one could consider more Eastern-based philosophies in yoga. My grandmother was classified as a yogini, a yogi master who lived in Florence, and I would spend every summer there. And as a young child, it was very clear that my grandmother was different and doing something different. And I learned very early on about prana. She was very close personal friends with Krishnamurti, a deep Indian philosopher, thinker. And so I always had that exposure. My training, however, is very conventional in nature, very reductionistic from the mind-body perspective, understanding how thoughts, emotions affect biology. And then when I started at MD Anderson over 20 years ago, of course, looking at the psychosocial side of things, and importantly, went back to my training and started looking at things like yoga and meditation. In 2000, MD Anderson published a paper showing that 75% of our patients were using complementary and alternative medicine, and we weren't guiding them in any way. And this actually is potentially quite dangerous, and also not appropriately guiding them into the areas for which there is tremendous efficacy, things like acupuncture, meditation, massage, etc. So I became the director of the integrative medicine program in 2002, and then started going down this wild world of quote unquote alternative medicine, drug development of Chinese medicines that we continue to do today. But this area, you can put up the first slide, of energy medicine was something quite different. It's an area that we actually do not talk about a lot at MD Anderson. We don't offer Reiki because, for those who know, MD Anderson is ranked the #1 cancer center, extremely conventional. But I was, approached a number of times and very interested in this area of energy medicine. Met this individual named Sean Harabance, who first and foremost is known as a clairvoyant, and is extremely accurate in predicting people, reading people, as Jason was talking about. And I was interested in the healing part and not in the clairvoyance. And in fact, to be truthful, extremely skeptical about the whole clairvoyant side of things. And there hasn't been rigorous, good documentation of clairvoyance except at the anecdotal level in terms of randomized clinical trial. And what Sean does is he actually looks at photographs and is particularly accurate about health issues. And the stories that he would share about these health issues became pretty obvious, that it's kind of hard to refute. But about 2.5 years ago, I'm sitting on my hotel room bed in Chicago, and I hadn't seen Sean for about 1.5 years, and I had emailed him a bunch of questions about myself and future, and more, calling on his clairvoyant side. And he said, we need to talk on the phone. Again, I hadn't seen him, he hadn't seen me, nothing about me. And he said, I'm happy to get to your questions, but I need to tell you, you have a blockage somewhere in your body and you need to go and see a doctor right away. He, of course, didn't know that I had a swollen lymph node in my, under my left arm. And that was a Saturday. I had a biopsy on Wednesday and found out that I actually had melanoma, which has been successfully treated, underwent immunotherapy, surgery, etc. But that made me a believer right at that moment. And we had already done some of this research that I'm going to share with you today. So we don't have time to get through all of the data, but important is to document this scientifically. And we've published one paper with Sean, and actually I just found out last night that our second paper was published. We've done lots of cell studies, these 4 animal studies, and I'll show you some of the data. And importantly, we had controls in each of these studies. So this next slide you're going to see is the survival curves, the growth curves of lung cancer in animals, with the red being the experimental group and the black and blue lines being the control group. Because I am so skeptical, I was the control person. And some, had argued, well, you have this yoga background, you're trained as a yoga teacher, and so potentially the effect could be even bigger. It's clear, that Sean's tumors are growing much slower. Next slide, please. More important is actually what's going on literally in the tumor. And I'm not going to get into all of the science here, and this is just one example, but we've done outcomes looking at genes, looking at immune function. What you see downregulated there on the left graph is actually what immunotherapy drugs are trying to do, decrease PD-L1 expression. Even more shockingly, and this is data that's in the newest paper, so you're actually all the first to see this data in any kind of public forum, was the increased amount of necrosis, literally in the tumors. So in this 4th study, we actually didn't see a big difference in the growth of the tumors, but the tumors were dying. There was a huge infiltration of immune cells, and clearly an increase in cell death, meaning the tumors were dying. So what is, unknown, and we'll get to this in the last slides, is, what's going on here? What you see pictured here on the left are my control animals. And they're just happy mice. They're walking around, moving around, exploring like mice typically do. If you go to the click next, you'll see what's going on with Sean's animals. I think you have to click one. There we go. So there's clearly, you don't need statistics to know that there's something clearly different going on. When I showed these images to my skeptical scientific sons, they said, well, there's no head against the ones on the left. In the fourth study, we set up GoPros at the back. We found everything was identical, and systematically looked at the mouse behavior. And they were clumped together and moving at least 50% less, the animals who were being exposed to the energy. So what does this mean? It's hard to know because we didn't do measurement of Sean and what was coming off of him, but they're clearly aware of something. We tried to put the word conscious in the manuscript, and the reviewer said, no, you can't use the word consciousness, but there's some awareness of what's going on. They're sensing something different that is leading to a change in their behavior. So, multiple studies done in cells and in animals showing that there's clearly something going on. It's in fact, irrefutable that this exposure to Sean Harabanz was creating some type of change in biology, all the way down to the way that genes are being expressed. So the challenge, however, is, and why this hasn't gotten published, the two papers in a highly ranked peer-reviewed journal, it's in a peer-reviewed journal, but with a relatively low impact factor, is because we didn't measure what was going on. Sean has had measurements of his EEGs, particularly when he's in his clairvoyant state. We have, with a lab up in Canada, they've actually digitized the EEG signature and pattern, created a device using solenoids and exposing, in some preliminary research we did at MD Anderson, cells to this electromagnetic field, and found quite intriguing findings, but the lab head has since passed away, so that research hasn't continued. What we really need to do is, to better understand this, is ideally measure what is coming off of the person's body to at least eliminate or keep on the table in terms of potential mechanism. One way of doing this that we're going to be doing with the future studies with Emerald Gate and Jason and his team is actually putting these cells in an enhanced Faraday box, which blocks the electromagnetic field. So if something about electromagnetic field from the healer has an effect, it should disappear when it's put in the box. Many people believe in this field that that's not going to block the effect, which will be important to prove, because then we know that it's something beyond that. Ultimately, we need to do clinical trials, and whether we wait until we have a device to do that, or that we do that with some of these healers like Sean and Bill Bankston, John Laback, and others who we'll be working with. Device development, as you heard, is ultimately the only way to scale this up if we're thinking about exposing the population as a whole with illnesses to these types of treatments. We're pretty good at device development as a society, and you're all aware that radiation, of course, is high photon emissions, and it's believed that it's biophotons that could be one of the treating elements here. Of course, proton treatment, a common treatment for cancer now, is the emission of protons. Again, high energy. Can low energy produce a similar effect? That's what we need to explore. But there is already a lot of progress being made in device development. But in some sense, that's a little bit of the cart before the horse, because we don't quite understand what is going on. So with that, I'll stop, and thrilled to answer questions and to get more into details in the breakouts. Oh, this is a great thing to consider. William James, the father of psychology, is just a beautiful sentiment, which, you know, is relevant for mind body. Hopefully is going to be relevant for energy medicine when people say it's not new and it's just embedded in the standard of care everywhere. Thank you.
So I think, thank you very, very much, Lorenzo. That was incredibly inspiring for me. I think the last quote resonates very deeply, and I think this is when Jason and I first met. There's certain things to me that are obvious, and I'm maybe a little bit more contrarian in my thinking. But I think it's one of these things where what's exciting to me about this incredible work is that when you see most of society discrediting something, I always think there's an amazing opportunity. And I think, Jeff, when you said the word weird, when you were at JP Morgan as the vice chairman and people were calling you weird, my uncle, who works with suicidal people, always is very interested in the origins of words and language. And I think if you look into the original origin of the word weird, it's the ability to see and control destiny. So I'm very happy that you're weird, and I think we're a group of weird people, and we should all continue to do things, because I think that's how we create meaningful change in the world. I think what we're going to do now is really go into the questions and answers. So if you continue to have questions, please feel to type them in the chat window. But I think David is sending me information on WhatsApp to help me curate them. But I think the first question is really from Caroline Van Egan. And her question to Jeff and to Lorenzo and to Jason and David is, are some of these healing practices being reimbursed in the US? And then if not, is anybody working on including these healing energy sessions into the healthcare system? She basically also noticed that there's a big difference between Europe and USA regarding reimbursing alternative healing practices. So I don't know, Jason or Jeff, which one of you want to respond?
Yeah, I'd say that that acupuncture today is relatively well reimbursed. The energy healing modalities to date are not. And one of our endeavors as part of the systems change effort is to continue with confirmatory clinical trials. There's a good baseline in a number of these, therapeutic touch, healing touch, and Reiki, for example, where we feel like we should be pretty close. And then secondly, and Jeff can speak to this, there are also alternative practices popping up, one of which Jeff recently invested in, that may be kind of the tip of the spear in terms of reimbursement for these types of alternative modalities that are showing efficacy and may show increased cost effectiveness as well.
Yeah, well, one of the things that happened with mindfulness is they set up MBSR, mindfulness-based
Stress reduction
centers in each of the hospitals. There's over 300 of them, and then the doctors started signing on. The nurses got it first with the nurses, then the doctors, and then the whole thing just started moving as well forward. So it was supported by those saying it's credible, and then supported by the major funders on the research side, so that then the FDA starts saying this is credible as well. So we aren't there yet on this one, as Jason said, but I think there is a path to getting there, because you look at return on investment. You know, a little bit of money in preventative care will save you a lot more than going to the hospital or emergency rooms or whatever they might be. And the insurance companies love that kind of idea. And so the insurance companies coming on board and supporting it was also a big driver and could be helpful here.
We've got three questions from Kate.
Can I just add one, you know, just reality check on the proposition of trying to get things like Reiki and anything in the energy medicine area reimbursed is without significantly more and stronger evidence, and particularly the mechanism, it will never be reimbursed. We're working very hard, as Jeff has said, you know, to get things reimbursed that we think we understand from a reductionistic biopsychosocial model like meditation and yoga, and there's been billions of dollars of research done in that area for the past decades, as with fMRI research and biology and the genes, and we feel we understand it. And even there's tremendous resistance. And when it comes to, but more acceptance, when it comes to energy medicine, it's going to be hard without the evidence. And the reality is that the NIH, as many on the call know, has made it clear that they will not fund this research. And the majority of research funding for medicine, besides the private sector, comes from the NIH. So groups like this are really critical for us to get the evidence base and to prove not only that it works clinically, but how it works.
Great, thank you, Lorenzo. So I think Marilio just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware that we're going to be scheduling a follow-up call for those who are interested, just given that the timing is short here. But let me move on to Kate's questions. There are 3 questions. Is how do you see this field helping to improve health equity? It's one question. What are the major critiques you've received about the research and potential for energy healing? And is biofield science effective at treating and working with trauma?
Great. So let me start with the research. The major critiques about the research to date are that a lot of it is exploratory research, not confirmatory research. In addition, what Lorenzo just alluded to, we can actually have clinical efficacy validated, yet have a tough time getting published in the high impact journals if we don't at least postulate a mechanism. And so that's why we're so focused not only on validating the efficacy, but also the mechanism. And there just need to be higher rigor anytime you're dealing with things that deal with consciousness. You need new protocols and new ways of measuring in an ideal world. Is biofield science effective at working with trauma? In fact, that pain and trauma are among the areas in which it's demonstrated to be most effective in those 200 to 300 studies that were shown. So yes, indeed. Whereas there could be, for example, treatment-resistant PTSD for many years, these types of modalities show that there is some level of efficacy, but there needs to be a lot more work done. And then just in terms of health equity, this was a discussion we had with Elliot and Peggy briefly the other day. Obviously, there is not equivalent access to healthcare, yet at the same time we see local practitioners and people making recommendations one to the next about things that have worked for them, right? Also, there are many conditions that are not well understood or even able to be categorized by allopathic medicine, yet at the same time, some of those are being interestingly addressed by some of these alternative modalities. I think the big shift is in enabling people to understand that, there is this energetic field of information, perhaps, which we also control consciously at some level. Not for everything, not for acute, conditions, but it's an extension really of this psychosomatic effect. And the opportunity, we think, broadly speaking, is that we enable folks to retake responsibility for their health, as opposed to divesting the responsibility in the hands of doctors. But I'd love to hear Lorenzo and Jeff's thoughts on any of those.
The equity side, there's now coming up much more indigenous practices, whether it's with American Indian populations, the Hindu strategies out of India. A lot of the immigrants coming to the U.S. in particular have their own practices that they want to bring in, and they're not officially, sanctioned by the medical system. And I think this is what's going to help us integrate in a lot of the practices that people now are bringing to the U.S. and then around the world. and start integrating and connecting with others. So that's one on the equity side. And number two, just in the mindfulness community as well, it's an affordable intervention. There's not a lot of, cutting and going to the hospitals, et cetera. And going through that kind of return makes it more, or lower the cost of the average treatment. I know I had it in carpal tunnel, and I didn't have to go through the knife when it was recommended, and I had alternative practice that got me out of it. That saved me a lot of pain, but also probably saved institutions a lot of funding as well.
In a book I wrote recently called Anti-Cancer Living, Transform Your Life and Health with a Mix of Six, we use the term that self-care is healthcare and wellness is available to all. And that's of course true, but I believe that, certainly when it comes to energy medicine, even what should be conventional things like diet and exercise, which are also not reimbursed by insurance, which, if we can't even get nutritional counseling and exercise counseling reimbursed appropriately for disease prevention, we're we're in serious trouble as a world. But these things, in the whole area of lifestyle medicine, which is expanding, and clearly prevention strategies will save lives as well as money, is available to a minority of the population that can pay out of pocket. And in fact, our whole medical model is built around still billing and making money. If all of a sudden the U.S. population were to become, let's be extreme here, vegetarian/vegan, exercise an hour a day, and all be within normal weight, we would have half the number of cancer patients coming into our center. There'd be half the number of people with cardiovascular disease at a minimum. That's not too good for hospitals. Now, I'm not saying that, there's this collusion of we know the answer and we're keeping it from people, but the incentives are wrong. So if we look to other countries with socialized medicine, and even those aren't doing it well, the incentives need to change. And when the incentives change, then what we prioritize as within insurance companies, even at an individual level, if we were to somehow come up with creative ways of changing the incentives, then there would be much more uptake of all of these things, the conventional as well as the unconventional.
Great. I think we have limited time left. I'm going to try to squeeze in a bunch of questions and let our presenters select ones which they want. There's questions about, do you have any experience or exposure with devices that mimic Schumann waves? And then there's also, can you share with us about scalar waves? There's also a question, is EFT tapping effective? There's a question about electromagnetic, basically 5G, so electromagnetic disturbances. And then what's your opinion on homeopathic medicine? And I guess finally, is there a seminal book on energy medicine? So those are a bunch of questions. I'm going to leave it to our presenters to decide which ones they want to tackle.
Great. So let me just say a few words about energy fields. So it turns out that our bodies maintain homeostasis through connection with things like the Schumann resonance, and there are devices out there that do that. In fact, astronauts are in connection with such resonance, because otherwise chronobiology and other elements of homeostasis are off, based on the research that I've done. As relates to that, electromagnetic frequencies and 5G, it's a very inflammatory topic. I try not to go off on the deep end, but when I talk to the water researchers, they argue that water and fluids in our body, in the interstitium, for example, and again, these are hypotheses, these are not validated, these are theses that they're in the process of validating or invalidating, are collecting information from the environment. In other words, our bodies are open systems in communication energetic fields around us. And this communication link ends up being damaged by some of the frequencies that we're swimming in, day out, whether it be 4G, 5G, electromagnetism. The only reason that topic may end up being of interest is because we're interested in life-affirming energetic fields. And if you're looking at life-affirming energetic fields, there are also deleterious energetic fields. And one of the ways that you would validate life-affirming energetic fields is by seeing if you could block them. And that has been demonstrated as one way to block them. Scalar waves, I was just reading yesterday about Konstantin Miles' work, which is fascinating around scalar waves. Scalar waves, there are many postulates as to what is this informational carrier wave that goes, for example, between the energy healer and the healee. And it's a much longer conversation, whether it's vector and scalar potentials or scalar waves. We're actually working with quantum field theorists to try to figure out what that is, but it's quite premature. But we're definitely working on it. Homeopathy, as I mentioned, with the water, fascinating results. That's when you kind of dilute things down below any substance in the water through succession, shaking. And there's a good bit of evidence that water indeed retains the energetic imprint of some substances. And so, there's some controversy around homeopathy. I've been focused on the principle and what can we learn from it and apply elsewhere. But you'll find substantial studies indicating that homeopathy is indeed valid, and then others that criticize it. So I haven't come to a conclusion on that yet, or EFT. I think EFT needs to be studied more, but Lorenzo may have a perspective on some
I
of
was
that.
just going to jump in on homeopathy, which is the lightning rod, if we were to use a term for alternative medicine. In fact, everything we've talked about today is the lightning rod for alternative integrative medicine, and why we choose to offer massage versus Reiki. There's no evidence to say that Reiki is better than massage, and massage is totally accepted, and we don't freak anyone out who send us their patients into our integrative medicine center. Homeopathy, again, we come back to the mechanism. It defies the laws of physics as we know them. When you assess what's in a homeopathy tincture, you should find nothing based on how we measure things. It is dilution below Avogadro's number. There isn't a single original molecule that's in there. However, we published a paper showing, and we didn't use the term homeopathy, we used the term ultra dilution in mice that do not, as far as we know, understand the placebo effect, and tumors grew smaller. And it was well controlled and all the rest of it. It wasn't extremely effective, if you were to compare it to a conventional chemotherapy. So we didn't pursue that and are pursuing natural products along those same lines as treatments. But it's clear that something's going on. And until we understand the mechanism, it will not be accepted. It is with conventional medicine. Aspirin, for example, was accepted as a treatment, even though we didn't quite understand what the mechanism of action was early on. And an interesting example of this evolution over time was a doctor named Semmelweis from Austria, who thought it was a good idea, based on his observations, that doctors should wash their hands before they deliver a baby. And he had noticed that when doctors and the physicians were delivering babies, there was high infant and mother mortality. Yet when the nurses were doing it, there was almost none and extremely low. And what he observed was that the nurses were washing their hands, the midwives, and that the doctors were often coming literally from doing autopsies and then delivering babies. This was before germ theory. Semmelweis he set up a clinical trial, and he actually washed hands in different ways with different antiseptics, and clearly showed scientifically that if you wash your hands in whatever manner, you decrease death. He was ridiculed. He was supposedly, historically, he was a very difficult human being, so he didn't make it easy to even accept him. But essentially, he was dismissed. That's because this was before germ theory. We didn't understand that germs existed, and it was before that total understanding. So without the mechanism, even something that we view as obvious today is dismissed. It's obvious that Sean Hairbands is impacting these animals, but until we understand how fully, it's going to be, I'm afraid, just dismissed, just like washing hands before delivering babies was.
Great. Jeff, do you have any comments, or should we?
No, go on. Let's
Okay.
wrap.
Yeah, so listen, first of all, I just wanted to thank everybody from Synergos who joined this call. Personally, this is, I think, some of the most important work that I see any of my friends or colleagues doing. It's incredibly inspirational. I do want to give a special shout out to David Dominic, who was on the call earlier. I don't see him now, but he is one of the key people that's been at work in this field with Jason. He has been a very successful person within private equity space, very practical and accomplished business person, but also I think deeply, deeply talented in other ways. I think he's an incredible musician and just an incredible human being and thinker. I know he wasn't highlighted here, but I at least wanted to recognize him because he's a key part of this work. And also I want to thank all of everybody on the call who's joined, and for your passion and for your sharing your experiences. We will have a follow-up call. If people are interested in connecting with either Jeff, Jason, or David to learn more about their work, please do so either through Melissa or directly on the emails that you see on the screen. These emails will be sent out to you. I think also if you're interested or people are interested in joining Jeff, Jason, and David on this journey, this collaborative journey to create systems change within the group that they're forming, please reach out to them directly or through Melissa. And finally, I just am, so happy to be able to be seeing all of you on Zoom. And, I really can't wait for the moment where we'll all be able to be together in one place to actually connect physically. And that day will be coming. We're not quite sure when, but just sending a lot of love to all of you. And thank you to the Synergo staff, to Peggy, and to everybody else. It's been an amazing honor to basically facilitate this session. And we look forward to the next one. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.